I could still remember my first motorcycle ride ever. It was on a KV75 Kawasaki mini bike, and I don't think it had any brakes. It was a fast little bike. It was kind of an unforgettable experience. You know, I had my dad holding the rear fender, and all of a sudden you start turning the throttle and you're on your own. And there's something about that freedom and the slight anxiousness you get from the acceleration, and then, when you start to master that control, it's a beautiful feeling. That little KV, man, I could talk about that forever. Motorcycling is obviously a huge part of my life, and I had the privilege of kind of being born into a family where that was really, really encouraged. So my family's been riding since the 70s and, racing for a good portion of that as well. So a lot of this was sparked from them, and it's definitely become a lifestyle for me. My Uncle Nick, my Uncle Steve, all through the 90s racing, I mean, that was really impactful to me. They're all really dedicated people. So yeah, really special to be able to spend that time with them. So building the shop, it has essentially made a really great hub for us. We meet here, most Sundays, hang out, and we basically bench race and then actually go race. So it's like the perfect storm. Yeah, it's an incredible team sort of family thing we have going. And then extend that to all the wonderful friends I have. I mean, that's kind of what makes this whole thing go. I can remember being trackside with the clutch in a million pieces on my bighorn, and I mean, I got people swarming in to lend a helping hand, and most of them are guys I'm gonna race against in 25 minutes, which is really, really cool. So that's the stuff that keeps you really driven and wanting to keep doing it and being part of that community. It's just a great bunch of people to be with, whether or not you're building the bike, acquiring parts, racing, just going to get a coffee with your friends. We will share stories of, motorcycle successes and failures from 20, 30 years ago and still get the same kind of level of excitement. And then of course, being able to fire that bike up and relive it is the ultimate, right? It's all a really amazing people experience, really. My dad, my uncles, and my cousins, they all helped me come up through the motorcycling community, and I'm at a great spot where I'm now helping my son and very soon my daughter into the motorcycle world too. So sharing that almost reignites your passion for bikes. So it just becomes a full circle. So my favorite part is kind of seeing the reaction of the sounds that my kids have to these bikes, and understanding the freedom that you ultimately get with some of these, and seeing what sticks out in a young person's mind. I think that's really cool. A lot of my time now, I spend double riding on a mini bike with my kids and just kind of getting that passion instilled in them. That's kind of some of my favorite riding now. You don't always have to ride the big fast bike. Kind of mixing it up and just going through the gears is a beautiful thing too. And then another, kind of amazing thing to acknowledge is some of the aging motorcycle riders. I mean, I've ridden with guys like Helmut Klassen. Stan Nicholson passes me on his TZ250 pretty regularly. Dave Roper. I mean, this is just, the list goes on and on and on. But I mean, seeing guys that are, able to do this well, into their life is a huge inspiration. So kind of a reason to keep healthy, and, another way the sport gives back to you, really. The other great part about motorcycling is just, I know, as you know, Pete, the treasure hunt of it all. So, I mean, we're all into vintage motorcycles, and they're still out there to be found. And, every time you acquire one of these vintage bikes, it goes well beyond just picking it up. It's the story of the history of the bike, and then the experience with the seller, the trip you made to acquire it, and then the restoration, finding the parts. It really develops a big story and journey that you go through with this stuff. And it's not easy to build a bike, or it's not easy to race a bike, but it is that effort and that connection that you build with the bike and the people that make it such a triumph in the end. Even when you have breakdowns and mechanical failures, it's it still feels like a win because, you know, you made it, you're enjoying this old stuff, and the part I like is that it can be really done at any level. I mean, I've worked out of a garden shed before. I've worked out of my mom's basement. Motorcycles can fit anywhere, and sometimes you gotta use what you have available. Even though if my wife doesn't like when I'm cleaning parts in the kitchen sink, that's one of the realities of the sport. One of the biggest things I love about the hobby is the creativity. So you can take motorcycles that were never intended to go fast or never intended to hill climb or motocross or road race and do everything in your power to make that happen. It's really amazing overcoming some of the quirks of these vintage bikes, and it's mostly the imperfections of the bikes that we end up loving. Stuff like that sticks out on your mind, and it's what kind of keeps the stories going. So even if those stories get embellished as the years go on, that's kind of part of the fun. I definitely gravitate to the vintage stuff. I definitely identify with it more just based on what my upbringing was and watching my family kind of, you know, race and, you know, fix all this old stuff. And then the other great thing about the vintage bikes is that you can be, you know, endlessly creative. That's the best part for me, is making those changes and having the courage to go in a strange direction with a motorcycle is a really fun thing to try and tackle. I love that. And then the R&D work, once you've built the bike, that's kind of where it just begins. You know, firing it up and testing it is kind of everything. I built my CR500, again, kind of an unconventional road race bike, but I took a bit of inspiration from the Superbikers series from the 80s. You know, it's a high horsepower, kind of gnarly two-stroke, but it's, again, one of those fun, quirky, interesting to ride motorcycles, and it is exciting. Probably my all-time favorite bike, my Kawasaki Bighorn back there. The Bighorn is really near and dear to me. My dad bought me one when I was probably about 12 years old, and he had another one, so we'd ride them as a pair. Probably would have been safer to give me a GSXR 1000 or something. It felt like the Bighorn was gonna, you know, pull my arms out of the sockets at the time, but at least that's how I remember it. The Bighorn I have now, it's been a labor of love. So it may not be your perfectly restored, sort of pristine motorcycle, but it's a functioning race bike, and I'm really proud of the R&D we did on it. So it's that outside the box road race bike. You know, we got really good power out of the bike and worked on the handling tremendously. You know, different front ends, different wheels, different brakes. I mean, it is never ending. And from one week to the next, you may see the bike and it may have a different caliper, or it may have a different carburetor, or it may have a different type on it. And it's at a very exciting stage now. So we got a whole new and improved engine coming out for it. I got my beautiful expansion chamber from my buddy Gary at Retrodyne. Yeah, a lot of help from Bondi Engines putting together this new motor. So really excited to see what it'll do. And it's one of those projects that will never be finished. The intent is to always make it better, always improve it. And once it finally works perfect, which will probably never happen, then you can start making it look a little prettier too. That's kind of part of the fun. And the best part of it is learning from the failures, but it's those really good rides that stick out in your mind and keep you going. I tend to gravitate towards kind of oddball motorcycles. I probably have my dad to thank for that. So he built this bike in the mid-90s, and it's a pretty unique machine. It's got a Kawasaki 3-cylinder engine with an extra cylinder added on. So back when he was building this, I mean, it was a pretty out there concept, and you know, kind of seeing that, you know, unfold as a project and as a process, and him bringing it to the racetrack and kind of some of the reactions to it, I think that really stuck out at me as a kid. And kind of seeing his passion when he raced it in a 3-cylinder form too. I mean, this was his, you know, his passion. He'd be working on it through the week, getting it ready. Kind of doing a quick restoration on this thing was a really special thing for me. So, I mean, again, I kind of was really enamored by this bike as a kid. So this thing was sitting in our shed for a long time. I think it ended up in my dad's basement. And, you know, as time passes on, they deteriorate, especially if they're not in motion. So I did a kind of a quick once over on it and added some of my sort of touches on it. And that was a really special thing. So a lot went into that. I mean, I painted the motorcycle myself. And then, of course, one of the best moments for me was watching my dad ride it again for the first time in, you know, 30 years. So that was just a big day for us. You know, we went to a random parking lot where, you know, sort of like the place we would have been testing it in the 90s, and kind of cut my dad loose on it. And yeah, it was just one of those moments that I think sent us all back in time for a minute. So hearing this thing fire up it's kind of unforgettable. So it's like a bit of a symphony coming through that exhaust, but definitely a big moment. And then from there on, the stories of, you know, people's reactions, you know, it's one of those bikes that becomes like a bit of a folklore thing, right? And that's what I love about motorcycles.